Welcome to the Climate Gap Quick Cuts, the podcast for busy people building climate solutions. We spotlight founders, builders, operators, and investors doing the hard work behind real progress. I'm Ben, co-founder of LMC. We connect climate tech companies with the people who make scale possible. Let's get into it. A lot of energy pilots die on the vine, not because the tech doesn't deliver, but because the structure doesn't actually scale. Too many start with vague metrics, soft incentives, and no path to rollout. But what if you flip that? In this episode, I'm pleased to be joined by Elizabeth Redmond, head of sales at R0, who's helped lead their evolution from pandemic-era health pilots to an energy-first platform. We get into how to design pilots that embed automatic rollout, speak the language of both CFOs and facility managers, and why in today's market, smaller isn't always smarter. Let's get into it. Elizabeth, welcome. Before we dive in, could you kick us off with an introduction to you, your background, and how R0 made the pivot from health-only pilots to an energy-first construct?
Yes, I'd love to. Thanks, Ben. So my background is in sensors, IoT, and space utilization. So I really cut my teeth in the deep, more tenant-oriented space utilization environment of implementing sensors across giant office towers and helping occupiers understand how they use space. R0, however, was founded at the dawn of the pandemic, really in an effort to democratize access to technologies that make buildings and spaces more healthy. Throughout that process, R0 became, very, very invested in the ASHRAE HVAC standards, ventilation standards, understanding exactly what's required to operate a healthy environment. And through that journey, we reached kind of an epiphany moment of, wow, we're really over ventilating space, even to keep people healthy within those environments. We're over ventilating based on what we know about occupancy now, what we know about ASHRAE standards. And that is really what kind of landed us on the energy opportunity.
Okay, so today we want to dive into a familiar topic from pilot to portfolio. And I'd love to kind of dive in about identifying scale-ready pilots. So everybody will be aware that not every pilot can scale from day one. How do you spot which programs have the executive sponsorship, technical fit, and KPI clarity to graduate into a full rollout?
Yeah, so I really love this subject. I think anyone working in the built environment is faced with this challenge around pilots. Is what do we do about pilots? It's really necessary to, use the pilot to figure out how the technology is going to be assimilated into the rest of the existing systems within a building, but then also use that as an opportunity to build trust. How do we work together? Do you actually like working with us? Do we fit within your vendor landscape from a personality perspective, but as well as the technology perspective? So I think, breaking that down into a few different pieces, looking first at the executive sponsorship. That is definitely the job of our sales team and ensuring that we are building trust with those stakeholders very early on before we are even talking about the pilot or getting to that pilot stage. So that once we get there, we understand what that working model is going to be. And then the technical fit, of course, is super important. This is one that we feel like we have a very good handle on. We're targeting regions and types of assets that are very specifically fit for us. Wherein, we might not have intermediary parties like a tenant, for example, that could be a blocker to rolling out at larger scale, or where we're in specifically high utility regions where the pain point is going to be more acute versus somewhere where energy is not as big of a concern from that cost perspective. One thing that our product team has worked really intently on specifically to help us kind of cut down on this process and at least minimize the length of implementation is a pre-scoping tool. So really getting into the utility rates, that peak detail, understanding how much of the utility bill is associated with peak and what we can actually shave off, and being as clear in the quantification of that as possible so that we have a model of what we expect to save, and then we're tracking to prove that. And if we're on target to prove that out, then we have the pathway to expansion. And that really sets a framework for us to be able to go from the single test unit or teaser to the actual implementation.
I'm sure there's going to be a few nodding heads when they're listening to that. I want to move on now onto sort of building an energy first business case. Before, when we talked about this, you explained that during your career, you've moved from qualitative health wins to hard energy savings as a core metric. How do you design a pilot so that validated kilowatts per hour reductions become the capital justification and the springboard for enterprise funding?
Yeah, so measuring savings is quite complex, and what we've learned through our, current cohort of projects and the projects we've implemented thus far is that, it is so granular, and in many cases, it's one of those paradigms where you can just keep peeling back the onion, and the onion never disappears. You just keep finding more and more layers into how you can debunk your model, but then also add additional detail to your model so that you get into deeper and deeper granularity. And that is, not an exercise that anybody wants to go through. So our intent is really coming up with a construct that, again, we're building that model that we all agree on, that makes sense, leveraging, points from the BMS, that's real data, as well as utility data, as well as specific implementations within the site that have been contributing to the energy intensity figures that go into that model, so that we have a baseline. And that baseline is something we can agree on. We know that that's going to fluctuate, obviously, with temperature, with seasonality, just even cloud shade on a daily basis. And all of those factors are at least elements that the majority of the industry is familiar with at this point from other energy modeling and energy efficiency practices. What we have done, and this was another learning within market, is, we don't have any capital budget to implement new projects. And so we came up with a performance-based contract, slightly performance-based. We call efficiency as a service, which really allows us to use that model and say, all right, based on how much energy we think we can save, we can recoup our costs over this period of time by taking 20% of those savings. Even if we're in the end taking 15%, 25%, we don't really care. Let's just call this a fixed cost per square foot based on those known savings. And you are still getting the lion's share of that operational cost reduction over, this 3 or 5 year period. And so that has allowed us to really land on something that is fixed without getting into the fluctuation of having to renegotiate energy models on a monthly or quarterly basis.
And as you said, who's got time for that regular reality? Okay, so as we work through a pilot, inevitably scaling means more cooks in the kitchen. What governance structures or, say, smart building council forums would you recommend to establish to keep finance, FM, sustainability, and ops all rowing in the same direction?
Well, Ben, one thing you may not know about me, I am married to a chef, so I love cooks. All the cooks in the kitchen are welcome. I think this is something that the industry at large, my background more on the tenant landscape, for a decade, there's been a dialogue around bringing all of these cooks together. And so it's really exciting when you have an opportunity to actually engage with so many stakeholders. And fortunately, in this scenario, all of the elements they're interested in are really, currencies to us. So we talk about energy, carbon, and time. These are all elements that we can very quantitatively track from a savings perspective or a reduction perspective. So energy is important to finance. It's also important to sustainability, but carbon may be the main metric that we're actually reporting to sustainability that goes into that ESG report. And then time is an element from just operationalization of the actual technology that we may be able to reduce. And that goes across our broader technology platform into smart filtration, where we're reducing the amount of time that people have to actually spend at the air handling unit replacing filters. Similarly with occupancy-based controls, if we are, instead of running a building on a schedule, we're reducing time by implementing new control sequences. This is, extending the lifespan of mechanical systems, reducing the amount of time that maintenance needs to be performed. And subsequently, what comes out of this technology is more information and insight into predictive planning, so you can schedule time more effectively. So all of these problems being solved together is actually really quite challenging to communicate to finance why time matters so much and the actual detail of the time that we get into. But of course, they understand that time costs money and costs them money. And so foundationally, the layered value proposition really tracks with all of our stakeholders, but understanding the amount of detail to share with each is really where the dance starts to happen.
Yes, I can imagine. And I didn't know that your husband was a chef. I've got some chef envy there for sure. All right, so moving through, right, we've got all of our stakeholders and, everything has been positioned well. I guess the next step will be embedding scale triggers into the pilot, so you've said before that the secret is baking automatic conversion clauses into your pilot agreements. How do you structure those triggers, defining thresholds or validation methods and pricing terms so that the pilot can be run seamlessly?
Yeah, again, so that very early stage model sets the framework for us, and we effectively write that out in our contract. If we are successful in delivering these savings, then this will automatically renew, and we are automatically going to take over the entire building. And we've already, built the framework for engaging with the MSI or the controls contractor to implement a new sequence of controls, to run any cabling that may be required for installing new networking infrastructure, and as well as the mechanical contractors on a filtration side. So all of that has been work that we've invested in that we just need to scale up, essentially. So that has been a huge unlock for us, and being able to kind of get our customers to agree that, all right, now we have the success criteria. We know what we need to track. And if we're successful after 6 months, this prescribed period of time, we have the pathway to expanding that's fairly hands-off for them. We know how to implement in those next phases, so we don't have to take too much of their time.
Okay, so I feel like there's some really good insight there for people that may or may not have had a same or similar strategy. So thank you for sharing. Looking back, what's the single critical insight you wish you had before pushing your first pilot into a full portfolio rollout?
Yeah. Again, kind of back to our first topic, in that pilots are always a part of understanding how technology is going to interact with the built environment. And I feel like every facilities team you interact with, they want to see it in their own living, breathing environment. They understand the claims that we're making. They want to believe them, and they do believe them, but they don't know how to believe them within their own context. So one thing that has always been true is just what is the right size of a pilot. Historically, my frame of thinking has always been, you want to keep it small enough so that it's a teaser, but it doesn't actually satisfy the thirst for data or learnings or whatever it might be. In this scenario, we actually want the pilot to be as large as possible. So ideally a whole building, because then you don't have to take that additional step of scaling to the building and then to a broader piece of the portfolio. Also getting to full building and making that investment in that initial period with the framework of a contract that allows us to, roll over with success, as showing we're making a bigger investment in you, where we have high confidence that this is going to be successful. So we want you at the table along the way with us as well. And that's where we've landed, and that has been kind of a big aha moment for us as well.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I feel like you've given us a real whistle-stop tour to escape the pilot's graveyard and build clear energy-first pilots. So thank you ever so much for your time. I know there will be lots of nodding heads in the audience listening to some of those insights. So really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. So great to see you. Thanks for having me on.
So what's the playbook? There were a few takeaways, I felt. Start with scale in mind. If your pilot doesn't mirror the complexity of the portfolio, it actually won't survive the jump. 2, get sharper on measurement. Real savings start with trusted baselines and performance-based models your CFO won't second guess. 3, make rollout the default. The best pilots are ones where expansion isn't actually a negotiation. It's automatic when success is proven. And finally, and maybe most important, stop designing for belief. Design for proof. Big thanks to Elizabeth for laying it out for us. That's Quick Cuts, short episodes, sharp insights, no filler. Catch you next time. You've been listening to the Climate Gap Quick Cuts. If you're building in climate tech, subscribe to hear more from the people making it happen.